We're really excited to host this virtual workshop on building the clean hydrogen workforce. This is part of a broader series for our State Clean Hydrogen Working Group, a webinar series focused on a number of different clean hydrogen topics. And we did have a webinar on hydrogen workforce issues last fall, but really hoping that this workshop format can provide an opportunity for a deeper dive on this topic. And we're really excited to have a broad range of speakers joining us today. So just a quick thing to flag before we get started. NASEO is working to finalize a hydrogen workforce tool as part of a toolkit of resources for state energy offices. And the aim of this tool is to really help state energy offices understand and respond to the challenges and opportunities for the clean hydrogen workforce. So it offers some key examples of actions that state leaders can take, including assessing clean hydrogen jobs and demand for jobs, building key partnerships with other state agencies, labor unions, nonprofits, and other training partners, and options and incentives for encouraging job quality and expanding access to clean hydrogen jobs. So we're currently seeking feedback and incorporating feedback from our working group members, and we'll hope to publish the toolkit later this fall. So stay tuned for that. And just a few quick Zoom reminders for everyone. This is a webinar format, so please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the presentations. We are really hoping to leave at least 5 to 10 minutes after each speaker or panel discussion for audience Q&A. So make sure to think of questions and topics for discussion during the presentations, and really hope that we can get some good engagement from our audience today. And we are recording this webinar, so we will post the slides and recording to our website, as well as share the slides via email with the registrants. So next slide, please. I'll just give a quick overview of our agenda. As I mentioned, we have a packed lineup of excellent speakers today. We'll start with a presentation by Thomas Green with the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office at the U.S. Department of Energy. And he'll provide an overview of the recently finalized U.S. National Clean Hydrogen Strategy and Roadmap and the opportunities for clean jobs in the hydrogen space. And next, we'll hear from Pat Hufnagel-Smith with Creative Links International, who will give a presentation on the workforce required to advance a low-carbon hydrogen economy. And then for our first panel discussion, we'll hear from Christopher Collard, Senior Analyst with the Utah Foundation, as well as Susanna Shawen, Vice President of Education for the Louisiana Community and Technical College System. And then because this is a longer workshop, we're going to take a quick Zoom break and then come back for our final panel discussion focused on promoting equitable access and job quality in the clean hydrogen space. And we'll hear from panelists Dr. Nikki Luke with the Office of Energy Jobs at the Department of Energy, and Aziz Dekan, Executive Director of the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs. And then we will end the public portion of the workshop and transition into a discussion with our working group. So this will be open to all states. If you're not part of the working group, but you do want to join as a state, feel free to direct message Kelsey Jones and she can send you the Zoom link, or email either of us, and we're happy to provide that. So with that, I will turn it over to Thomas to get us started.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to be with you today and open up with some high-level table-setting remarks about the clean hydrogen strategy and roadmap that we released in June, and how clean jobs fit into that picture. So on the next slide, just a high-level overview of where we're at today in terms of our energy consumption. So today we have about 13% of our primary energy that comes from renewables. A growing share of that is wind and solar. But we have a lot of other types of fuel that will need to be replaced in terms of our goals to decarbonize. If you advance one, we have ambitious administration goals that we hope will help get us on this path to net zero. We have a goal of reducing 50 to 20 to 52% by 2030 for our Paris pledge, and a goal for 100% carbon-free pollution, a clean grid by 2035. And all of this, we hope, will fit into the Justice 40 program of ensuring that 40% of the benefits of our climate investments flow to disadvantaged communities. So these are huge goals, but we're looking at a monumental shift from this picture on the left of what our current energy consumption looks like. On the next slide, we see a snapshot of hydrogen and fuel cells in the United States today. So today we have 10 million metric tons produced annually, but almost all of it is dirty. So like we saw on the graph on the left, it's 0% renewable energy for these. Now, hydrogen is primarily supplied to the refining sector and some of the chemical sector. So ammonia and methanol, you need hydrogen to be able to perform those chemical reactions. For the refining sector, you need hydrogen to remove sulfur and to break up the heavy chains, the heavy carbon chains that exist. Partly because we import so much of our fuel from overseas that is, as they say, heavy and sour, so it has long carbon chains and a lot of sulfur content. So we need a lot of hydrogen to refine oil, primarily in the Gulf Coast. Now, on the far right, we see examples of clean hydrogen deployment. So this isn't necessarily a chemical industrial sector, but it's these new sectors of backup power. So looking at data centers, telecom infrastructure, needs backup power like that. That's where some deployments currently exist. Forklifts is one of those examples where we've seen a niche market really adopt hydrogen a lot quicker, just because of environmental benefits and some technical advantages over battery forklifts for warehouses that can't use diesel. And we see, some hydrogen uptake primarily in California of fuel cell buses and cars. But in this middle graphic here, we see announced projects across the country of where hydrogen is planned to be produced and consumed, across all the United States. Now, announced projects totals 12 million metric tons of hydrogen, so that would almost completely replace the currently produced hydrogen from dirty resources. However, only 1 million metric tons of those have reached a final investment decision. So that means over 11 million metric tons are still sort of in the balance in terms of their final investment decision. And a lot of the companies are honestly just waiting on finalization of tax credit rules to make those decisions, see how those will play out. But we have a lot of geographic diversity in terms of what those where these will be sited. There's definitely concentration in Texas and Louisiana. There's concentration in California, but we would see potentially hydrogen projects in a lot of states around the country. Next slide. Now, I'm sure this is news to anyone, but the bipartisan infrastructure bill included $9.5 billion for clean hydrogen programs. Most notably, it includes $8 billion for at least 4 clean hydrogen hubs. We announced we'd select between 6 and 10. It required the development of a national strategy and roadmap, which has now been released. And I will walk through in the next slides. And then the Inflation Reduction Act included a lot of tax credits that can benefit hydrogen. And most notably is the hydrogen production tax credit, which is up to $3 per kilogram for clean hydrogen that gets produced. You get more money based on how clean your hydrogen is. So it's up from 60 cents to $3 depending on that carbon intensity. But then there's also tax credits for hydrogen fleet vehicles, for consumer vehicles, for trucks. There's eligibility for hydrogen under 48C, for example, which is the manufacturing tax credit. So producing hydrogen equipment that would go into, say, a fuel cell vehicle. So there's a lot of tax credits in there that benefit, but really the production tax credit is the one everyone is talking about and will be definitive of the sector. Next slide. So to give some overview of the national strategy and roadmap, the strategy breaks down into three components. First is to target strategic high impact uses of hydrogen. And so, in the past, we've been almost entirely focused on hydrogen cars. However, a hydrogen vehicle is not as competitive to a battery electric vehicle. So we're targeting, what are the strategic and high impact end uses of hydrogen, where hydrogen is necessary for that industry to decarbonize, such as in ammonia, where they use it today. You have to use hydrogen in order to make ammonia. So using clean hydrogen is a way to decarbonize that sector. Other things like heavy duty trucking. There's technical advantages to hydrogen over battery electric vehicles. Just in terms of refueling time versus recharging time, there's a strategic advantage there. So that's number one, is really focus on where does it go and does that get us closer to decarbonizing our economy. Second is reducing the cost of clean hydrogen. The hydrogen shot target, the goal of producing hydrogen at $1 per kilogram by 2031 is really key in that, and we are pursuing a lot of technologies in the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technology Office that can help get us there. Then finally, focusing on regional networks. So the clean hydrogen hubs will certainly be a central part of this strategy, and we really want to tackle the chicken and egg issue of trying to match demand and supply at the same time by co-locating production and end use, and hoping that we don't end up with the same picture of the last time everybody was interested in hydrogen in the early aughts, and they didn't really come at it from this regional network approach. So those are our three strategies, and there's a lot of enablers to help us to get there. Noticeably, good jobs, workforce development is the first one that we list in those enablers, and it will be critical to all three of these strategies. On the next slide, diving in a little bit deeper to the first strategy of high impact end uses, we announced goals to produce up to 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen by 2030. So those announced projects would pretty much get us there if they all have a final investment decision. That was 12 million metric tons that they had announced. So that's a goal by 2030, and up to 50 million metric tons by 2050. So this would be, and again, we have 10 million metric tons produced today. So none of that is included in these numbers, right? So this is all clean hydrogen. These are new hydrogen production methods to service new markets. So this is not just looking at these traditional sectors like ammonia and methanol, but looking at how it can be used to decarbonize steelmaking and how it can help integrate more renewables on the grid for energy storage. So it's really cross-cutting across all these industries, which is also why we will see such tremendous geographic diversity with hydrogen adoption. There's a lot of space for hydrogen to play a strategic role in a lot of different sectors, and that'll just look differently depending on what region of the country you're in. So that's the opportunity, and if we reach that goal by 2050, we will see 10% emission reductions compared to 2005. We did some analysis looking at how many jobs would be created by 2030, and we found up to 100,000 jobs could be created, both direct and induced. Now, this is honestly not as high of a number as other industry groups have announced in the past. Some people have been very, very bullish on the job creation that can come from hydrogen. But there's tremendous potential here. And I think one thing that isn't captured in this number is potential job preservation. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the skills that you have in existing industries, especially existing energy industries, and the hydrogen workforce. The California Building Trades already has training programs for hydrogen technologies that they offer to their union members. And I think we'll only see a growth of that as we have more traditional industries looking into hydrogen as an alternative. So not captured in this number, but hoping that hydrogen can really be a solution for job preservation in a lot of states across the country. On the next slide, I mentioned quickly before, but the hydrogen shot, that's our 1-1-1 goal of producing $1 for 1 kilogram of clean hydrogen 1 decade. So that's by 2031. And we're already seeing some progress towards this, but also some barriers in terms of increasing inflation and some uncertainties in terms of capital costs. But we just launched $750 million in funding opportunity for research and development to lower the costs and to build domestic manufacturing and to really be an innovator in terms of the manufacturing methods and recycling methods for hydrogen technologies. So really excited about that and continuing to work towards this goal. And then finally, on the next slide, the third strategy, focusing on regional networks. The regional hydrogen hubs, again, will be a key part of this approach. We conducted a request for information, so we saw examples emerge from different stakeholders who responded to that RFI. As you might expect, each region has different natural resources that they would hope to leverage for hydrogen production. They have different end uses and different industries in their locality that will, be a target for end use, and different connective infrastructure that might be able to match the two, whether that is pipeline construction, or whether that is rail, or whether that is through transport, or whether that is just through co-location and trying to produce hydrogen where you use it. On the next slide, I can't remember if I have one more. Oh yes, the guiding principles that we have. We listed out 7 guiding principles, or sorry, 8 guiding principles, and of course, growing sustainable jobs is one of those. But also, I want to highlight fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion. Advancing environmental justice has been a huge topic of conversation for our office. We've been developing a strategy for our own research and development to go into that, and we hope to keep growing that focus for our office. And in fact, we were just having a conversation today as part of the environmental justice team, talking about potentially collaborating with NASEO on how to hold conversations on siting and permitting. And so I would definitely be excited to reconnect and continue this dialogue in terms of how we can make sure we're talking about jobs and all these other considerations at the same time. So that should be it for me. Oh, that's right. I wanted to say something quickly on 48C. I mentioned before that there was this tax credit for hydrogen manufacturing. But just to note again, we received full applications at this point, but we're expecting to see a few rounds of 48C. This is a competitive tax credit. So people apply for this one. They announced $4 billion, but there will be $6 billion still available for this. So definitely keep an eye out. It's a great opportunity. I was just in Atlanta with Senator Ossoff, and out in Atlanta in Georgia, their manufacturing is a huge part of their economy base there. This is a great opportunity for, even if you don't see yourself as a primary producer or consumer of hydrogen, there's still a lot of opportunity across all states for developing a robust workforce for manufacturing of parts and components that would go into the hydrogen economy. So just want to highlight this as an opportunity. I think not every state sees themselves as part of the hydrogen picture, but there's certainly space for everybody. And that should do it for me. Again, we can. I guess we're up on time, but we can probably skip to the end. But I appreciate you all tuning in.
Great. Thanks so much, Thomas. That was a really helpful overview of all the great work your office is doing and the intersections with workforce development and job training. I do have a question for you, but also wanted to let the audience know that we can take any questions for Thomas. We can spend a few minutes and then we'll move on to the next presentation, but feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A. But my question, Thomas, I know the federal government recently announced a new partnership, the Hydrogen Interagency Task Force. And I'm curious if you could speak to any workforce components of that and any planned partnerships between DOE and other agencies like the Department of Labor.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so Department of Labor is a signatory on the Hydrogen Interagency Task Force. You can learn about the task force at hydrogen.gov. We made a new, very simple URL for all of the hub of that information. So yeah, Department of Labor will play a part in safety is one of the things that they highlighted. So OSHA standards will be a critical enabler for developing a safe and sustainable hydrogen workforce. We've also collaborated with Department of Labor on the prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards. So reviewing those as they informed Treasury guidance on that. And so we will continue working with them on prevailing wage and what that means for hydrogen deployments as we're constructing more and more hydrogen projects. Yeah.
Great. All right, I think we have one question from the chat. Do you know how we can make updates to our 48C concept papers after submission since the portal has closed down?
Great question. I don't believe edits are, you can make that in the portal, but you can always email, there should be an email, it should be like 48c at hq.doe.gov. But there should be an able on the funding announcement that you can reach out to, let them know that you'll have an edit to your submission, and they will be able to answer if they can accommodate that.
Great.
Thanks, Calvin.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I think in the interest of time, we'll keep going. And now I will pass the floor to Pat.
Great. Thanks, Grace. Thanks for being here. Very pleased to be able to share this piece of research that I did with the Transition Accelerator based in Canada. Really, the motivation for the Transition Accelerator to do this work was to set a foundation in terms of understanding the workforce required to advance a low carbon hydrogen economy as a springboard for others that are looking at this. So, at least that first piece of defining what the workforce looks like could be done and others could leverage it. So happy to share this and share any of the other resources that have been developed as part of this project. If I could just go to the next slide. Just a bit about me. All I'll say is I am a labor market consultant that has been working in the energy sector to really kind of understand how, the business, environmental, regulatory environment associated with the energy sector is impacting the workforce, and trying to be proactive in terms of understanding what those trends might be so that industry, government, post-secondary institutions, and others can really be proactive in terms of preparing the workforce as well. Based on where we're going as a sustainable energy system. Next slide. I thought I'd maybe start in just giving a bit of a context in terms of where Canada's hydrogen industry is at. And actually, it was very interesting as Thomas was talking. I was kind of going, check, check, check. We're all in very similar spot in terms of where Canada's industry is and where we see ourselves going, as what Thomas talked about for the United States as well. Canada too has current production. We're about 3 million tons per annum. And similarly, many of the uses associated with the current production is for industrial processes, and for the most part, we're using SMR, reforming natural gas in terms of producing that hydrogen. I think what's interesting in terms of some of our current production is that 3 of Canada's 4 carbon capture projects are attached to hydrogen production. One is at a refinery, one's at a fertilizer plant, and then one is associated with an oil sands upgrader. So really going forward, looking at leveraging that experience in carbon capture coupled with SMR or other kind of natural gas reforming production of hydrogen in order to get to those low carbon hydrogen production goals. So let's a little bit in terms of, so let me take a step back. Based on that current production, we obviously have a workforce that knows how to operate, produce, and handle hydrogen safely. But I think as we look at where we're headed with what we want to do in terms of expanding both low carbon production of low carbon hydrogen production and expanding end uses for hydrogen on the pathway to decarbonization, recognize that we're going to need to scale that workforce fairly significantly. Again, just going forward, you know, very similar to what Thomas was talking about, we're looking at, you know, how do we increase both demand and supply for hydrogen, and really, you know, paying attention to those demand value chains, recognizing that you're not going to attract investment into low carbon hydrogen if there isn't a demand, if there isn't a market for it. So really what we're seeing in terms of sort of expanding or advancing the hydrogen economy, a lot of focus being put on how do we expand that end use. So certainly industry processes, being able to decarbonize some of those heavy emitting industrial processes by leveraging low carbon hydrogen, but also in transportation, also in utilities, blending with natural gas, and also looking at our opportunity to export clean hydrogen through ammonia. So like I said, a lot of similarities, and really I think was this sort of vision for building out demand for hydrogen to be a bit of a catalyst for growing low carbon production of hydrogen. That was a catalyst for Transition Accelerator to making sure that we have the workforce required to deploy as we see fit. Yeah, so again, we're kind of looking at from a low carbon production perspective, how can we leverage our natural gas feedstock, our experience with reforming natural gas for hydrogen, but also leveraging our CCS experience. We have a lot of opportunity for expanding hydrogen production using electrolysis with a specific focus on wind, both onshore and offshore. But we also have a lot of hydro generated electricity, and so that too is also seen as a tremendous opportunity. And then also because a lot of our wind, offshore wind, could be used also to produce hydrogen for export. Looking at, you know, first that would be hydrogen into ammonia in order to transport it for export. I've on this slide also is just a diagram that kind of looks at or pulls together those pictures of those key labor supply demand value chains for the hydrogen economy. Next slide, please. So what did we discover in terms of taking on this work to understand what we needed from a workforce perspective? And bottom line, what we learned is that the workforce required to advance hydrogen looks a lot like the workforce that we already have in terms of, you know, the existing occupations for our other industrial processes. So we And let me just say the scope of the research was to really focus on the operations and on the operations of the value chain, less so on the construction of the infrastructure required. And so I think, as Thomas said, there is, when we look at building out this, the hydrogen economy, there's going to be a need for a lot of infrastructure, and see that as driving a tremendous amount of construction workers. So while we see that really the core technical occupations required for the hydrogen value chains are really going to rely on those foundational technical training that already exists. And so what we determined was we don't need to design curriculum to, say, produce a hydrogen engineer or a hydrogen electrician. Really what we're looking at is augmenting the existing foundational training that we already find within our post-secondary system with training that really ensures that those workers know how to operate, produce, and safely handle hydrogen. I would say that was even true in terms of some of the emerging occupations, such as those that would be more focused on, fuel cell technology. Even those kinds of occupations are really sort of building on the foundational knowledge that's delivered by our post-secondary and training system already. I think what was sort of a key concern for industry in terms of that we're involved in helping us define what this workforce looked like was almost less so on having that specifically hydrogen trained person, although they recognized that that was key. They felt that we could certainly get there in terms of providing this foundational expertise in our labor market with the training required for the hydrogen industry. Some of their greater concerns was really that many of these occupations are already facing talent shortages. So in our existing sectors, never alone trying to scale up and add to the labor market and the number of jobs that would be associated with hydrogen. And so again, some of the things that Thomas talked about really resonated in terms of not only training to produce and handle hydrogen, but also just how do we expand that talent pool and looking at some of those untapped talents and ensuring that we're really seeing a more fair, equitable, and inclusive participation in scaling up the hydrogen requirements. Next slide. So a little bit about, just in terms of the, even though we have that foundational training, where might be the places where we need to strengthen the technical skills? And I think, really what we heard from those that are already working in the industry, companies that are already producing hydrogen, is that hydrogen really is no more or less safe than other energy sources or carriers, but it is different. And so it's being able to, provide training to those that are taking some of that foundational technical training through universities and trade schools and polytechniques. Provide them with the training so that they understand the risks that are associated with hydrogen and are building the competencies to operate and handle it safely. So these are just some of the things that we found in terms of, the kinds of areas where would need to think about specific skills upgrading so that the people working with hydrogen understood, process and engineering controls that are specific for hydrogen, understanding how the use of hydrogen or production of hydrogen may change the selection and application of materials, coatings, sealants, all those kinds of things that we're using based on, some of the specific properties and characteristics of hydrogen. Expect that, as we scale and build out the hydrogen economy, there's going to need require a lot of rigorous materials and equipment inspection and testing. Obviously that's to ensure that the integrity of the new infrastructure is in place, but also really to create a lot of, public confidence in the use of hydrogen because of, some of the, concerns about whether or not hydrogen is as safe as, say, the natural gas that we're using today. Certainly the electrochemical processes, especially with electrolysis and the use of fuel cells, I think that we really saw that as being a area where we currently don't have a huge workforce that has been involved in the electrical chemical processes that we see increasing with the deployment of hydrogen fuel cells. And really our research indicated that this is one area where there are some, there's skill shortages across the board. There's a very tight labor market when it comes to those that have an understanding of those electrical chemical processes. Obviously, the regulations, codes, and standards as they pertain to hydrogen, as Thomas indicated, we too in Canada are, just building out some of those regulations, codes, and standards. And so it's a little bit of a parallel process in terms of, building out those regulations while also training people on them. And then obviously safety training for all workers involved in handling hydrogen, and then some specific expanded training for anybody who may be responding to emergency situations associated with hydrogen. Next slide. I think the other key thing that we found in terms of advancing a hydrogen economy is that you are looking at, in some ways, making changes, transitioning what people necessarily think around traditional industries, building out sort of the market pull for hydrogen. And so the study really kind of identified some occupations that, even though these particular occupations aren't necessarily hired to the degree that those technical occupations are hired within the hydrogen economy, without the talent in areas of business and commercial development, some of those ESG and sustainability roles, inspectors, policy and regulatory specialists, talent shortages in these areas can really be a bottleneck in terms of achieving that desired pace of change. And so certainly thinking about how are we bringing along or providing some of these other non-technical roles in some ways that wouldn't necessarily be true for inspectors to ensure that we're building out the ecosystem that can advance hydrogen at the pace we want it to in order to achieve some of those climate goals and net zero goals. I would also say on the digital occupations front, any new infrastructure is going to have the most recent up-to-date digital and technical applications built into them. And again, this is another area where we're already seeing shortages around some of those digital occupations. And so again, just thinking about how do we ensure that we're building the talent pool so that they are available for the hydrogen industry as well. Next slide. So, while the report that I worked on didn't try to quantify the number of hydrogen jobs required, it was more, like I said, set that foundation of just what are the occupations that are involved in a hydrogen economy. Did start to think about, what are the numbers, how, and certainly some work that has come since the report was put out about 1.5 years ago has focused more on thinking about when and where and how many jobs might be created. And so very similar to what, again, Thomas was talking about, the jobs created are really going to align with the investment and activity. And so really trying to keep track of, the progress of projects. Where are they in terms of, any kind of assessments that they may, regulatory assessments that they may need in order to come to fruition? Where are they in terms of having the partners in place that need to be in place in order to see a project move forward? And here in Canada, part of that going forward is certainly looking at the kinds of partnerships that projects have in place with Indigenous communities and governments, because a lot of where we're seeing our resource development, including hydrogen, occur is on First Nations land. So those partnerships are really important. And then whether or not projects are reaching those final investment decisions. So really tracking sort of how projects are progressing to understand when, where, and how many jobs are going to be created. I think there was an interesting, I think I just read this morning, in fact, a report put out by McKinsey & Co. that they're suggesting only 13% of the hydrogen projects that have been announced have funding committed to them. So it gives you a sense, and I know you never want to overpromise on the jobs piece and train people without understanding whether or not those jobs are actually in place. So those are just some of the things that we're watching to understand the timing and numbers associated with job creation. Some of the other considerations that we're looking at are, again, similarly to what Thomas said, that projects and hydrogen hubs are going to look differently geographically. We expect that the different regions across Canada are going to leverage their existing strengths when it comes to production, but also in terms of looking at where's the opportunity to have an impact on near-term demand. And so that's really going to help define what a project or a hub may look like geographically. And we've really kind of moved away from, labeling hydrogen across its colors, because, well, there seemed to be a new color just about every week, and really sort of focused on low carbon and the carbon intensity associated with hydrogen production. So we know if a feedstock is accessible and affordable, that's more likely to be the production technology that's put in place. We also, in terms of thinking about job creation and training, really looked at how is the deployment of hydrogen technology most likely to take place, and really found, it's going to be about retrofitting existing systems or the conversion of existing systems. It's also going to involve, fuel switching, perhaps co-combustion and blending, and we're certainly seeing that happen. We're looking at our industrial processes to really sort of convert and see where they can utilize hydrogen as a lower carbon fuel. We're seeing that in terms of, say, transportation, where, we don't have a lot of 100% hydrogen semi trucks on the road right now because of all the infrastructure that's required around it as well, and the expense of that. But we sure are seeing a lot of co-combustion and dual fuel trucks in play. We're seeing our utilities, especially our heating, blending hydrogen with natural gas. So it's not going to be a flip of a switch in terms of how hydrogen is deployed. And in understanding that, that also allows us to think about the timing related to job creation. And I think the other thing that Thomas said that really resonated is, because we're looking at the conversion of existing systems, replacing or fuel switching, replacing diesel, say, with hydrogen in some of our industrial processes, that we're also seeing not only the creation of jobs in terms of scaling hydrogen use, but also the maintaining of jobs that may, in those high emitting industries, that may fall by the wayside as we try to move towards a lower carbon economy and address those net zero goals. So lots of benefits for hydrogen on that maintaining jobs side of things as well. The other thing we really had to pay attention to in terms of considering job creation is that a lot of the companies that are investing in hydrogen are our traditional energy and end-use industrial and transportation sectors. And so again, as they are looking to hydrogen to decarbonize and advance their own sustainability, it may be less about creating a whole bunch of new jobs and really sort of looking at how companies may be reassigning or redeploying their existing workforce as they make changes around their own processes and energy sources that they use. And so not that that doesn't mean that that workforce doesn't need training, but not to necessarily jump to the conclusion that because we're seeing increased production of hydrogen, that it's going to create a whole bunch of end use kinds of jobs as well, because we expect that it's going to be some of those traditional industries that are going to be using hydrogen, and that they're going to look at how do they reassign and redeploy their internal workforce. And then the other thing that we really, kind of thought about in terms of job creation is that chances are, because of how the initial deployment of hydrogen is likely to take place, we're really looking at augmenting the skills and knowledge of an existing workforce in a lot of cases. And that in the short term or in the nearer term, we may say workers that are really working in both hydrogen and traditional energy systems, or even in those end use sectors. So for example, a heavy duty equipment mechanic that's working on heavy duty trucks. We're not in a place where we see transport companies that have made a big switch to hydrogen. It's going to be gradual, and they're going to probably look at their workforce to be able to work on both systems in order to help support an affordable sort of transition to utilizing hydrogen more often. And so, yeah, that's some considerations in terms of how we think job creation may occur in hydrogen. Perhaps the next slide, please, Kelsey. Thanks. So in terms of thinking about, advancing hydrogen, we know that a well-functioning labor market will be required. We need the workers that are comfortable and competent in terms of working with hydrogen safely. And so while there's lots of considerations in terms of the timing and what that job creation might look like, we know that developing a well-functioning labor market doesn't just happen automatically, that we need to be strategic and deliberate about it. And so some of the things that we've seen in terms of the work that's being done, we are creating those learning opportunities through micro-credentials. So that would be, those short, sort of very competency-focused training on hydrogen-related skills and knowledge in order to provide that to those workers that have some of that other foundational training, trying to quantify what the supply-demand actually looks like, enhancing the diversity and inclusion and attracting youth so we can certainly expand the talent pool available. Looking at the opportunity to kind of change or shift the narrative related to working in the industrial, even traditional industrial sectors as a way of attracting talent, educating people that, working within a traditional industry, you can contribute to climate solutions based on what industry is doing to decarbonize. And then finally, to really kind of design programs that allow for some collaboration and learning as we go along and improving in terms of how do we build out the workforce required for hydrogen. And then just on the last slide, and you'll get this as the package, is just links to the report that was developed, as well as a workforce assessment tool that that sort of gives you a bit of opportunity to do a deeper dive on the unique characteristics of certain occupations working in the hydrogen economy, and also because it sort of looks at the workforce required across the whole economy and both the supply and demand value chains. You can kind of pick and choose based on, how hydrogen may be deployed in your region. And that's it. Thank you so very much. And happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat. That was a really helpful overview, and I think really sets the stage for the rest of our conversations today in terms of understanding what these jobs actually are and what the skills are, and some of the opportunities for incumbent workers to utilize their existing skills. And yes, Amy, we will be sharing the resource links after this webinar, so we'll share the slides with everyone who's registered and also post them on our website. But highly recommend everyone check out that report and the assessment tool. It's been really helpful in my understanding and just kind of understanding the lay of the land and all the jobs in the hydrogen space. Any questions from the audience before we move on? And feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A if you think of them later on. But I think maybe in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and transition into our first panel with Susie and Christopher. All right. So for this panel discussion, we really want to focus on some of the considerations for preparing the workforce and communities for this transition and the expansion of the clean hydrogen economy. So we're really lucky to have both Susanna and Christopher join us today. I think maybe I'll just let each of you provide some opening remarks, and then we can get into our discussion questions and then open it up for audience Q&A. So Susie, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Grace. And I think we had talked about maybe taking 10 minutes for the opening remarks. Would you prefer us to be a little briefer than that, or should we just go ahead?
Go ahead. Yeah, we should be good
Okay,
now.
all right, thank you. So I'd also like to say thank you to Thomas and Pat for really laying the groundwork here. And I'm not going to go a great deal into the context and background that we have here in Louisiana, but I do want to say a few words about it that I think mesh very well with what Thomas and Pat were talking about. I'm going to introduce myself briefly. I'm the Vice President of Education at the Louisiana Community and Technical College System, which is a mouthful and doesn't really tell everybody exactly what we do. We are the centralized system in the state of Louisiana that oversees our 12 public two-year colleges, and there are 2 other two-year colleges that we also work with in the public space. So we are in many ways the workforce development engine of the state of Louisiana, and we do realize that we have a pretty heavy lift in front of us. So before I came to LCTCS, I spent 10 years at Louisiana Economic Development, sort of on the other side, looking at business development and so forth, but also looking at the way that workforce development and economic growth are linked. So that is the lens that I bring to the work that I do at LCTCS and the lens that I bring to this conversation here. So I do want to talk a little bit about Louisiana. We do have an existing hydrogen workforce that is pretty extensive. And Thomas talked a lot about hydrogen for refining and for basic chemicals manufacturing. And those are 2 of our biggest employers here in the state. And so it makes sense that we already have a significant workforce there. We also do have a lot of momentum in the clean hydrogen space and in other adjacent fields like carbon capture and sequestration, and the clean energy work that's going on is also in many ways linked to Louisiana, particularly offshore wind. And those of you that have been looking at the auction today for offshore wind leases, the one that went through is right off of Lake Charles, Louisiana. So we are going to enjoy that first major U.S. federal wind lease. And we are really looking forward to working on that. But in many ways, and I think Pat really got to this, you know, the story of clean hydrogen is new, but it's not new. There's a lot going on that is really an evolution of our continuing work rather than a shift from one thing to another with a clean break in between. So we see in Louisiana right now, the folks that are working on developing the offshore wind opportunity are the same industry partners we've been working with all the way through, even to the construction of the turbines themselves. Our major shipbuilders are involved in that, not just in Louisiana, but actually around the country and around the world. So we are seeing the energy partners also evolve. So when we were talking to our energy partners about clean hydrogen, it's the same players that we've been working with for quite a long time. But I will also mention that there are some new players in the field. So it's not just same old, same old. We see the same sort of thing with the skill sets. And Pat, again, I think covered this very thoroughly. We have a desperate need for people in the skilled trades, and I'm going to bring that back up again. But what we're really seeing is a lot of the skill sets in the existing energy and chemical manufacturing space are really highly transferable to the clean hydrogen space. The place where we're really seeing new skills demands is in the clean energy production side. So with solar and with onshore and offshore wind. And those are places where we are developing programming that I'm going to mention just a little later. I do want to talk about the other real challenges with the workforce, though. It's really not the new skills that are needed that is the challenge. The first big challenge is scale. And it's not just that this is a new industry that is growing on top of an old industry, but we have a whole lot of other stuff going on. So there's a lot of infrastructure investment, both at the state level and at the federal level. In Louisiana, we just broke ground on an enormous coastal restoration project off the Mississippi River. We're building a bridge across the Mississippi River. We're building another big bridge in the state. We've got a lot of highway work going on. We're capping orphan wells. We are building new municipal water systems with federal funding. It keeps me up at night because every single one of those projects needs people with commercial driver's licenses, and they need heavy equipment operators, and we don't have enough of either in the state, and candidly, we never have. And it's not like we can pull those folks in from Texas and Mississippi and Arkansas, because they need those folks too. So I think a major part of the question here has to be, how do we get more people interested in these types of jobs and the educational pathways that lead to them? That is a huge part of the challenge. Another part of the challenge is always the hard part with workforce development, is figuring out who needs exactly what, where they need them, and when they need them. A final issue is making sure that our companies are opening space for new workers that are not ready to work without supervision. They also need to be open to working with populations that they may not have traditionally drawn from. That's the only way they're going to meet this workforce challenge. That's the only way we, as the educators, can help them meet this workforce challenge, is by being open to working with populations that don't necessarily see themselves in our colleges, in our programs, and in jobs like this. So I want to talk very quickly about an effort that I feel is going to shape our approach to the solutions to those challenges. And that is H to the Future, which is a $75 million federal and state investment through the Build Back Better program in building out the hydrogen opportunity, the clean hydrogen opportunity in Louisiana. I don't have the space here to tell you all about the project, but you can find a lot online, but it's super exciting. And I do encourage everybody to reach out with questions after this call as well, because there's a lot going on here that I think is going to inform some of, or should inform some of, the national solutions. But with that effort, I do want to just mention a couple of things that we are doing that I think are going to make a big difference. Of course, we are always going to have fully engaged relationships with our industry partners. That's how we ensure that we have total coverage of the workforce needs, is by working directly with them to understand what they need, where, and when. Each one of our colleges is going to be hiring a dedicated person, but it's not a traditional grant coordinator position. That person will be responsible for building the industry relationships, bringing that back to the college, but ultimately making sure that that bridge between the program and the job is really there, that the students are landing quickly and easily in a particular job with a particular employer at the end. We are also working with, many of you are probably familiar with the PTech curriculum, which is a standard process technology curriculum around the country. We are working with NAPTA, which oversees that curriculum, and many of our industry partners in the Louisiana Chemical Association here in the state to refresh that curriculum to include aspects that are particularly relevant to the hydrogen workforce. And those are probably going to be modular, that will sit at the end of the program. And then just a quick explanation of how we are addressing part of the chicken and egg problem with, building programs and not having the jobs here yet. One of our community colleges, Nunez Community College in Chalmette, Louisiana, and we are Louisiana, so yes, we say it Nunez. I'm not mispronouncing it. It is not Nunez. Nunez has recently built a wind energy technology associate's degree program with some exit points along the way, and that has been approved by the Louisiana Board of Regents. We will be deploying it now to focus on onshore wind, but the components of it that are relevant to offshore wind will be deployed later once those jobs are available and ready to go here in the state. So we have something we can point to from a business development standpoint in terms of attracting companies to the state, but we're not producing students for jobs that don't yet exist in the state. So I'll wrap up by just saying we're a leader in this space. We absolutely are. People don't always look at Louisiana that way. We are also a guinea pig. We would love to hear from others, either with questions on how we're doing something or advice on how we might do it better. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Susie. And now we'll hear from Christopher on the context for clean hydrogen jobs in Utah.
Hi, so I'm Christopher Collard. I'm a research analyst with Utah Foundation, and we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit research think tank for the state here. And one of the projects we've recently been looking at is kind of Utah's industry or energy industry. We've done a kind of a series of projects in the past. We kind of looked at coal counties in Utah. There's 5 or 6 rural counties in Utah that are heavily dependent on coal. In terms of extraction and then using that to power, and you know, in those 5 or 6 counties, the coal jobs represent probably more than 10% of the jobs in these rural counties. So it's very they're a strong part of the economic engine in these counties. And we've also been looking at as coal declines, as many of these plants kind of age out and are replaced with either natural gas or other energy sources. What can we do with these, or what can these counties do to continue having jobs to support their citizens? And one of these counties has a really interesting hydrogen project going on, where they're converting their coal facilities into a combination of natural gas and hydrogen facility. And so this agency, it's called the Intermountain Power Agency, and this was actually it was formed back in the 70s, where a bunch of Utah and California municipalities got together to pool their resources to build a power plant. And then they ended up selling Utah municipalities realized that they could make money by selling all of their energy to the California municipalities and securing their energy elsewhere. So this is a power plant in Utah that sends 90% of its energy produced to California. And so with California adopting new clean energy standards, they weren't willing to buy the coal supported power anymore. So as they were considering the future of this industry, they realized that there's a great opportunity. This power plant is next door to some salt domes. And these salt domes have the capacity to store both liquid and gas. In the past, it had been storage primarily for petroleum and other liquid energy sources. But they developed a partnership where they can store gas. So the new plan is to have these to produce hydrogen in a renewable way using the solar and wind power. In many ways, this county is well positioned in terms of its ability to produce solar power. They'll be able to store that hydrogen in these geological formations, salt domes, so that they can really use this as dispatchable power. It's on demand whenever they need it. And initially, it will be a combination blend, 30% hydrogen, 70% natural gas. But starting in 2025 is when the project's expected to be completed. It's under construction right now. And then over the next 20 years after that point, they expect to move fully to hydrogen production by 2045. And so that's just a little bit about the project itself. And we were also asked to kind of look at the economic impact. What is this providing for the community? And if you were to compare it to the previous coal-fired power plant, it has a smaller economic footprint. It requires fewer jobs, both in terms of in the power plant itself, as well as up the supply chain. And so it does have a smaller, reduced economic impact, but at the same time, if this hydrogen project wouldn't happen, the coal plant would be shuttered anyway, because just of a lack of demand for its power and sources. So in some ways, it's it wouldn't be happening. All of these jobs, none of these jobs would be happening if it weren't for this hydrogen solution. And so if you look at all the jobs, there's the construction part going on right now. It definitely provides a lot of construction jobs. But also just like after the construction's over, looking at the ongoing jobs in terms of both the electrical generation and then also the supply chain jobs in terms of providing that hydrogen. It's going to provide about 120 full-time jobs for that specific industry. And then when we also looked at the supply chain jobs and kind of the induced spending, it's going to support this economic activity supports about 600 jobs in the community, which represents probably close to 12% of all the jobs in this area. So it is something that's very impactful for this community, and without it, they would be facing a very dire economic situation in many ways. But more than that, we also wanted to look at kind of how this impacts the community as well in terms of tax revenues. And so, there's different states have different taxing methods. In Utah, most of the local governments are supported by property taxes. It's kind of reserved for local governments instead of any other government. And then if we look at the property taxes for this area, for this project is probably going to be $15 to $19 million. And that's kind of between 40 and 60% of the current property tax proceeds for all of the local governments, the school districts, the water districts, the cities, the counties, kind of covered in this area. So it represents really a sizable, this is an industry that really supports this community. Unfortunately, this is a great, fortunately for this county, this is a great solution for them. But Utah has 5 or 6 other coal dependent counties where this isn't as available to them, and they might need to. I mean, we've done some research looking at some other things to help their communities, but this hydrogen in some ways currently is a little bit limited in where we can kind of apply this as a solution for a kind of a clean energy transition.
Great. Thanks so much, Christopher. And thank you, Susie, for your remarks. This is going to be a great conversation. And I think, Utah and Louisiana both have kind of different contexts, but I think there is an opportunity for leveraging the skill sets of those incumbent workers in both areas. And so, Susie, just to start, a question for you. You had mentioned this H to the Future initiative and the role of community and technical colleges and partnerships with industry. I'm curious if you could talk about those partnerships. What is the role of industry? How can state agencies and local governments get involved? Are you working with any other community partners or nonprofit organizations? And what will the retraining sort of look like as part of this initiative?
That is a fantastic question, and I really appreciate the opportunity to give a shout out to my old friends, the economic developers. So the people who actually received the Build Back Better grant for H to the Future are GNO Incorporated, or Greater New Orleans Incorporated, and their associated foundation. And that's the economic development organization that represents New Orleans and the other 8 surrounding parishes, which is what we call counties here in Louisiana. And they're the ones that receive that funding. Our economic development partners at the state level and at the local and regional level are absolutely critical to building those healthy and robust industry relationships with our colleges and with other educators. So they've been taking a really important role in helping to convene not just those partners, but other community partners, including the workforce development boards, including a lot of folks from other agencies and entities that sort of touch people who are looking for help. to whom we can speak about the opportunities that these jobs offer. That's part of our strategy for expanding the populations that we're working with. And we do, in this grant opportunity, have 2 equity partners who are the Urban League of Louisiana and the Louisiana Parole Project. But we will be working with countless other equity partners and other community partners in a lot of different ways around the state in order to deliver on this opportunity. We can't do it alone, and we do like to work as closely as we can with our regional workforce ecosystem partners.
Well, and Christopher, it looks like there's a question for you in the Q&A. For the Utah case, would it be re-education of coal workers to hydrogen and natural gas? But also fewer workers, what would the rest of the workforce do?
Yeah, so there's, in some ways there's been a lot of, for this coal-fired power plant, a lot of the workers are nearing retirement age. And so they've been planning this for a while. As they've been going along, they've kind of been letting attrition kind of reduce their workforce as they scale down a little bit. With the remaining workers, they are looking at retraining existing workers, as well as when they bring projects on, new workers on, they're more working on more of a contract basis as well, to allow them, give them a little bit more flexibility as they kind of figure out, this is kind of a new thing. They're not exactly sure how this is going to work out, and they're trying to maintain a little bit more flexibility, but they are investing in retraining.
Great. And Susie, another question for you. You had mentioned, outreach and education in terms of recruiting new workers into this space is going to be crucial. And I'm just curious if you could speak to some of the existing methods or new strategies that the initiative is thinking about in terms of expanding the pool of workers and trying to attack that challenge.
Well, it is a challenge, and if I had easy answers, we would have already done it. But I will talk about a couple of things that we're really working on. First of all, we absolutely have not fully utilized the WEOA system and the workforce development boards in our regions. And we know that they have a lot of folks, for example, who work directly with the veterans communities, who work directly with tribes, who work directly with populations who may be unhoused. There are a lot of folks that they are directly interacting with, as are other partners in systems like Children and Family Services, our Department of Health, and so on. In other words, there's a lot of outreach happening to people and communities that we want to reach, but our message is not necessarily yet part of that outreach. And then there is also the case that we are working with people who need access to services offered by these other entities. So integrating all of that into a comprehensive case management system where we can do warm referrals between different partners and make sure that the connections actually happen instead of somebody just being given a phone number, I think is going to be a really important part of the picture.
Great points. And Susie, I know you have to jump for another meeting, but thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insights, and happy to share the link to the initiative with folks on the line, and I'm sure they can reach out with questions, or if they have, if they would like to chat further about this. So thank you so much. And Christopher, if you're able to stay on for one more question or any audience Q&A, that would be great. Let
me just jump in real quick and assure everybody that what you just said is totally true. I will talk anybody's ear off about any of these subjects, so please feel free to reach out. But thank you all very much, and sorry that I have to go.
No worries. Thanks so much, Susie. And Christopher, just to end with another question, I was wondering if you could speak to kind of the process for doing this economic analysis, and For states that may be in a similar position with coal plants or other traditional energy infrastructure shutting down, or if they're thinking about converting it or transitioning it. How did you kind of come up with this assessment of the job and economic impact for this community?
So it was kind of an interesting process because there's not a lot of really good data yet of what hydrogen jobs look like. And so we figured the best way, as a broad category, we figured the best way was to dig down and try to analyze this kind of as a role kind of process. Like what are the roles the individual employees are going to be doing? How many of these employees will be dedicated to managing solar production or wind production that generates the hydrogen? These are definitely more established. We definitely have a lot better data on that. Looking at the storage caverns, it's going to be, it's a little bit different from storing liquids, but kind of a lot of the same process. So we kind of looked at the existing jobs there. In terms of like looking at the operating the plant, hydrogen versus natural gas. We kind of assumed that the production is going to look fairly similar to the natural gas jobs. So we tried to break it down role by role. And as we kind of thought through this process, we kind of came a lot to the same conclusions of some of the earlier presenters, that a lot of these roles are going to be very similar to existing roles, but just with an additional component added to it. And so that was kind of the process that we went through as we tried to figure out how this would have an economic impact in this community.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Christopher. And if there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. But I think for the sake of time, we will just take a quick Zoom break and reconvene in, let's say, like 3 minutes, because we're running a little bit behind. But thank you all for being engaged in this conversation so far. We're really excited for our next and last panel discussion with DOE and the Connecticut Climate and Jobs roundtable next at, we'll say, 3:56 Eastern. So take a quick Zoom break and we will be back shortly. Thanks. Hey, Nikki. Kelsey, if you don't mind. Oh, you've already got it. Perfect. Thanks so much. And I will make sure we have Aziz as a panelist as well. Great. Well, thanks everybody for sticking with us. I know this has been a lengthy workshop, but really glad to have the opportunity to dive deeper into this topic and hear from this great lineup of speakers. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our last panel, which is focused on really trying to promote equitable access to clean hydrogen careers and ensuring that those jobs are good quality. So first we'll hear from Dr. Nikki Luke with the Office of Energy Jobs.
Thanks so much, Grace and Kelsey, for organizing this panel today, and everyone for the wonderful presentation so far and for being here. So I am going to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which the Department of Energy, and specifically my office in the Office of Energy Jobs, have thought about questions of community benefits planning. And then hopefully we'll have some more time to talk about how this relates to the specific questions of workforce issues in hydrogen as we get into more of the discussion section. So you can go. Thank you. So just a little bit of background on the Office of Energy Jobs. It was created to support job creation and job quality across the DOE enterprise and connected with DOE's mission to ensure America's security and prosperity, addressing energy, environmental, and nuclear challenges through transformative science and technology solutions. And so while the Department of Energy has always had this really strong focus on research, some of the recent legislation that we've been talking about today has led us to have more of a focus on thinking about skilled trades work and specifically construction and manufacturing jobs. And so the Office of Energy Jobs is housed within DOE's Office of Policy and coordinates jobs and labor policy with DOE, other agencies, and across the White House and on the Hill. Next slide. Thank you. And so Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm has really framed this, the question of jobs, as central to some of the policies around energy that the Department of Energy is currently working on. She says, quote, "I'm confident that as the American people see and feel the benefits from our effort to transform America's economy, lower costs, create jobs, and create our national security, we will build momentum and broaden support for further action." And a central way in which the DOE has been thinking about these questions is through the framework of community benefits plans, which we see as having several benefits in addition to those outlined by the Secretary, including reducing risk of opposition to projects or delays in project completion, maximizing benefits for workers and participants, communities that are hosting projects, ensuring long-term success, and building durable support for the implementation of strategies. Next slide. And so community benefits plans break down into 4 areas that are each overlapping and hard to discuss without touching on the others. So those are Justice 40, which Thomas talked a little bit about at the beginning of the discussion today, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, good jobs, and workforce and community agreements. And I'll focus on good jobs and workforce and community agreements, but there is a whole suite of resources from the Department of Energy available to think about community benefits plans, as well as templates for how we think about possible strategies of implementing and designing community benefits plans as well. And so central to sort of thinking about what improving equity in and job access looks like is trying to define and understand what makes a job a good job and why people might choose to apply, or what attracts them to an industry, or why they might stay within a particular job. And so the Department of Labor and Department of Commerce have agreed on principles of good jobs that are linked in the slide here. And I think these will be shared with folks after the presentation. And so what we really encourage people who are applying for funding from the Department of Energy, or who we are working with, to consider is that in the beginning of the planning process, think about these questions of equity and think about the questions of creating good jobs in the planning phase to consider how to attract and retain a skilled workforce, particularly given some of the concerns of a competitive labor market we've been discussing today. And to really value workers, the skills that they bring, which are essential for quality workmanship, innovation, and efficiency. And when designing project implementation plans, consider and articulate how there will be investment in workforce education and training, outreach to different workers, to different groups to support bringing workers who might be underrepresented in the energy sector into these spaces, and understand that investing in good jobs is also an investment in communities, given the direct positive impact that good jobs can have. And so when we think about those buckets of community benefits planning, investment in good jobs really breaks down into two categories. We see this in terms of job quality. So thinking about how, again, ensuring that jobs are of sufficient quality to attract and retain a skilled workforce through competitive wages and benefits, workforce education and training programs, through labor management training partnerships, on-the-job training, registered apprenticeships, covering tuition costs or paid time for professional development and continuing education. And so these echo a lot of the things that Susie was talking about, strategies to bring workers who might not have those skills to learn on the job and to be engaged in improving their workplace, including through the design and implementation of workplace safety and health plans. And a second key area is increasing worker representation and opportunities for workers to give a voice on the job, such as supporting worker organizing and collective bargaining beyond the minimum legal obligations that are consistent with the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. This could come through a commitment to negotiate a project labor agreement for construction activities, a pledge to remain neutral in the union organizing campaign, intention or willingness to permit union recognition through card check, or a pledge to allow union organizers access to appropriate on-site non-workplaces, and again, really valuing a worker's voice on the job. And another central pillar of how we think about community benefits planning is in the context of community and labor engagement, which is setting up those relationships and the conversations that, again, to echo Susie, are part of ensuring that there's a pipeline or a pathway for workers to come into good jobs, to thrive in those positions, and to gain skills and have access to the supportive services that they might need to thrive in a given job. And so specifically, we're interested in different kinds of stakeholders or organizations that might be central to project success, which could be local governments, state governments, tribal governments, labor unions, and community-based organizations that support or work with disadvantaged communities. And community agreements and conversations can take a variety of forms, from community benefits that might be delivered to disadvantaged communities, specific strategies for accessing jobs and business opportunities, investment in training, and different strategies for resolving disputes, and ensuring accountability to community engagement plans to ensure that both the project and workers and community partners understand and can agree on the standards for given project implementation. Next slide. And so a couple ways in which the Department of Energy has started to think about this in the context of hydrogen that, again, Thomas discussed really well, are that we see these questions of workforce development and equitable workforce development are really echoed through strategies to try to bring workers into the sector, to try to ensure transition pathways for workers who might be moving from one type of energy employment to another, through on-the-job training programs, flexible work policies, collaborative targeted training programs between unions, community colleges, and universities. These practices of skill-based hiring to widen the pool of candidates and facilitate populations that, again, might not have traditionally thought of themselves as working in the energy sector in the hydrogen space, and using policy in many different ways to support good jobs that can attract talent and ensure skill acquisition for the new workers, in the emerging hydrogen workforce. And so if you have any questions about community benefits plans, the Office of Energy Jobs, or anything else I talked about after our discussion today, feel free to reach out to me. My email is here, and I'm happy to take any questions later. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nikki. And now, Aziz, if you wouldn't mind just giving an overview of your organization and the work you've been doing in the clean hydrogen space.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank all the other panelists who came before. I especially want to thank you, Nikki. Your presentation sort of echoes what we're trying to do in Connecticut, which is to, make sure that all these projects. Let me stop. The Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs works with the trades, environmental organizations, and interfaith social justice groups to promote a just transition from fossil fuels into renewables. In particular, we believe that labor needs to lead on climate. And one of the things that, so I'll go back to where I was starting, which was with Nikki saying that, from the Department of Energy's point of view, we echo all of that. We like to try to say that what we're looking for are jobs that go from fossil fuels into renewables, but that they also are part of a just transition to those jobs. And really, what does that mean? And so you touched on community benefit agreements, and we believe that that's a key to all of this. All too often, we've seen in the fossil fuel industry and industries in general that they're placed in marginalized communities. And we want to make sure that the J40 communities are protected, and when they get a community benefit agreement, that they're kept to it. And we've seen obfuscation in offshore wind development, where they promise jobs and the jobs aren't delivered, especially in Connecticut. And we want to make sure that those standards are strictly held. A livable wage is really vital. I like to say that more than just good jobs, because people understand what a livable wage is, right? I mean, we're all striving to make that happen. And in Connecticut, we have in place workforce development organizations through the trades and others that can bring people into these jobs. I think the biggest concern that we have as part of the Connecticut Task Force on Hydrogen was, what are these jobs? What do they look like? And when will they happen? We've heard all too recently, and from the opposition, I think, to renewables, that, the IRA pipeline is so stalled and it's going to take a long time. But these are new industries, and these are new sectors of energy that are going to take some time to develop, and take time to bring people into those workforce development pieces. So, just going back to community benefits, those are the places that I see, and that our organization and our partners see as a real key to workforce development. If we can go into communities, engage stakeholders, engage cities, you can't just come into, and I'll give an example, you can't just come into Bridgeport, Connecticut, and decide this is where we're going to put our hydrogen plant. We need the full backing of the city and the full backing of the people in which neighborhoods are being put into. So it's a crucial piece to all of this. And again, engagement with stakeholders to create community benefit agreements that are seriously community-based, so that everybody has a voice in this. We also have some concerns about one of my fellow panelists talked about the different colors of hydrogen, and the blending of hydrogen, and I see some of those concerns as well. Again, this is a personal viewpoint that I'm worried that the natural gas companies are going to start blending hydrogen and claiming that that's clean energy, and I'm not sure that that's really the direction any of us, maybe including the Department of Energy, wants to go. So we have to be careful on how we define hydrogen. I know the task force in Connecticut has that as part of our scope of work. And then we also need to understand that these are multiple layers. So we need the legislature, we need companies to be good partners in all of this. And we need to, again, communities to accept this work. And as far as the roundtable goes, our view is to bring the trades into this so that there are jobs. They're not going to be there tomorrow, most likely, and I'd love to hear how Nikki and some of the people from the Department of Energy see the timeline on all of this. But we have to be observant about, that there are jobs out there, and that we should prepare the workforce to be ready for those jobs, and they are transferable. A lot of them are transferable for what we're doing now. I mean, I know my pipe fitter brothers and sisters are very excited about hydrogen because there's work to be done there. And I'm not sure if this is relevant fact or if it's even fact, but I've heard in different places that in Europe they're relining some of those gas line pipes to accept hydrogen, so that it doesn't leak out of the pipes. I still haven't. I heard that at a hydrogen conference last year, and that's of interest to, I think, of all of us. There's a lot of work if that were to be true. Regardless how you look at it, in Connecticut, the gas line pipes need to be replaced anyway. So if we're going to start replacing those, maybe we should really consider having them lined so they can accept hydrogen, which from my chemistry days, I know is like the smallest molecule out there. So we should be cognizant of how we redo and renew our energy sectors. I'll just pretty much stop there, but I just wanted one last thing, and that's that, we talk so much about environmental justice. We talk so much about how equity plays a major part in the work that we do. And the hydrogen energy sector has a real opportunity to put those pieces in play. Again, I'll refer back to Nikki, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to your slides because I don't have them, but it was very refreshing to see the Department of Energy, and literally those could have been my slides, because it echoes what we're all trying to do, which is to make sure that there are equitable living wage jobs that do not harm J40 communities, and actually help marginalized communities and the people who live in those communities with livable wage jobs.
Great. Thanks so much, Aziz and Nikki, for your remarks. We do have a question already in the Q&A from Stephen Barrera, considering the notion of transferring the workforce of fossil fuel industries to renewable industries seems in theory to be a no-brainer. Here in Kentucky, there's a strong cultural tie to coal, especially in Eastern Kentucky. So considering this workforce transition and cultural ties to the fossil fuel industry, what advice, comments, or strategies do you have? And I think either of you could take that one.
I'll jump in for a quick second, but look, every community is going to be different. Every state is going to be different, but we've talked a lot about and bandied the word engagement. And I think engagement in all aspects of that is really important. And for the folks in Kentucky who are relying on coal, let's be truthful. Those jobs are not viable. I mean, they're just not going to be around for as long a period as everyone wants them to be. And we have to recognize that if those jobs are going to go away, what do we do with those workers? And that's, I think, the narrative that needs to be out there, and not just narrative, but the actions that we go from narrative to actionable items.
I would just echo, it seems like Aziz and I have a lot of agreement here. I think so. I'm actually based in East Tennessee, and we see a lot of those same conversations around attachment to fossil fuel industry, to the coal industry in particular. And I think the question of engagement is really important, because there's a strong sense that people have been told about this transition as coming for a long time that hasn't been realized yet. And so instead of saying some new industry is going to come along, having them be part of the process, workers, labor unions, community groups, is really central to both getting that buy-in and understanding, as I'm sure you're doing, and you know, those priorities around what a community would like to see. And in some of the conversations that I've had and we've had here, there is an attachment to certain industries, to the culture of that industry, but there's also an understanding that that was a good job, that a family supporting job with benefits. And so understanding what that might look like in a different sector and being part of creating that, whether that's a community benefits plan, a community workforce agreement, having a project labor agreement that guarantees the pay and benefits and new kinds of work, are all part of ensuring and working to earn that buy-in for new energy sectors.
Thank you both. And on the topic of community engagement, I'm curious, you both mentioned community benefits agreements as really critical tools to help ensure good quality jobs and livable wages. Just curious if you could speak to what makes a community benefits agreement strong and actually enforceable, and are there any examples of community benefits agreements that have really been successful, and or ways that states can get involved in that process, considering that, you know, it's often maybe the developer or the company kind of initiating that process, working with the community. But you had mentioned, Nikki, that state and local governments can also be involved in that process. So just curious to hear more about what that looks like, and maybe some good examples from other industries or even within the hydrogen space.
I don't have any examples off the top of my head to give you specific to the hydrogen space. Maybe Aziz can talk a little bit about some of the work in Connecticut. But there is, I think, we've seen state governments play a really important role in lots of the applications for bipartisan infrastructure law, now IRA funding, and I think that there's a really important convening role there to bring some of these partners together. And what makes a community benefits agreement a powerful tool is that there is that mechanism of accountability built in, so that there's engagement with labor, engagement with community where projects are cited, and an understanding of how industry will benefit, how the community will benefit, how workers will benefit, and mechanisms that can take the form of a legal contract to ensure that there's representation and remedies if there isn't, if the outcomes intended aren't being met. I'll also share, and I can put it in the chat in a second, there's a comprehensive suite of tools online through the Department of Energy, including examples of successful community workforce agreements from the Department of Labor that consider different ways in which these agreements have come together, and different priorities that communities might have, whether that's a really rural place or a more urban setting in which you're working with lots of workforce development partners and have strong union and community college representation. And so I think there's many resources that are available to think about what a community workforce agreement looks like specific to the community and the project that design one.
And in Connecticut, we passed a couple of years ago, we passed a renewable energy package that put in project labor agreements into projects that were greater than 2 megawatts, and that had a community benefit agreement within it. And part of that was to, perform a social characterization analysis describing community dynamics, decision making. It's supposed to identify stakeholders, in particular those who are impacted by project development. We wanted to make sure that the underrepresented and disadvantaged members and communities were represented into the community agreement as it was being formed. it was important to identify stakeholders into this engagement. We wanted to also make sure that the methods of stakeholder engagement were suitable for the goals of the projects. One size doesn't fit all. And I think it's really important that we have a two-way engagement. And finally, part of we talk about community benefit agreements, but it's also a workforce community agreement as well. So we want to make sure that that's incorporated into the community benefits agreement. One of the things we've been talking about project labor agreements, and we see a lot of pushback on that from legislators in Connecticut in particular, I can tell you. And there's times when I just want to change the word project labor agreement into just calling it community workforce agreements, because that's really what they are. Again, one of your slides, Nikki, showed how it protects workers. And so that's what community benefit agreements do too. So, we have an example of that in Connecticut that we hope to incorporate into whatever hydrogen work that we do in the state.
Great. Thank you both, and thanks for adding that link in the chat, Nikki. One other question I had related to trying to expand the pool of workers in the clean hydrogen space, and particularly bringing in people who have traditionally been excluded or underrepresented in the energy sector. I'm curious if you could speak to some of the specific barriers that those populations face in accessing the training and the jobs in this space that they may face in the hydrogen sector, and maybe some strategies for overcoming those barriers and really expanding access to good quality jobs.
Nikki, do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Okay. I think the barriers that the workforce faces for hydrogen are similar to all the barriers that marginalized communities and people in marginalized communities face in any sector, right? One of the things that can make me a little bit crazy is that we keep hearing over and over again how unions don't hire people of color and they're racist, and the past history shows that to be true, but the current history, at least in Connecticut, is not that. And I can show you that the proof of that by going to the training facility, in particular up in Pomfret, Connecticut, where the people who are being trained there are predominantly people of color and women. And so that's changing. And I think maybe part of our problem with all of this is the perception of what's out there as opposed to the reality. We try to do cohorts that are self-selecting. We do workforce fairs. In Connecticut, Connecticut Building Trades has been very good at working with the Department of Corrections and getting the formerly incarcerated into these programs. And those are the people I've worked with, the formerly incarcerated in my life. And those are maybe the most marginalized people out there. You could make that argument about so many other groups, but they face so many different obstacles. And if we can bring those folks into workforce development and into apprenticeship programs, it's a big key. And I'll just jump on one last piece. And then if we can find transportation opportunities for them that are based on hydrogen fuel vehicles, we double up. And so I think it's really important that we just look at the intersectionality of all of this is so crucial and so important for all of us to recognize and to not deny any sector, and encourage all of these pieces to be put together. And again, from the person in Kentucky and in Tennessee or wherever you are, every state, every community is different. And I think that the important part is that we listen and we try to bring in as many people as possible through however we can, to encourage those jobs. They're livable wage jobs. That's important.
That's a really, I feel like, a great note to end on. And so, but I'll just echo a few things, I guess, in terms of bringing women, people of color, people who have other barriers to employment, whether that's involvement with the criminal legal system or people who have been unhoused or are currently unhoused. I think that there's lots of different ways in which, again, to return to this tool of community workforce agreements, are part of bringing together supportive services, of bringing together mentorship, of training, on the job training that's paid, and ensuring connections to transportation, to childcare, to mentors who look like workers in these sectors, and ensuring that there is that there are the resources and assure and a pathway into employment, which apprenticeship can be a really important part of. So our office has worked with the Department of Labor on questions of pre-apprenticeship. So introducing workers to the trades and helping to ensure that they have access to some of those supportive services that are necessary to get a job and maintain a job. And then also apprenticeship is, again, a really important tool because it's an earn while you learn training program. And so people who might not be able to take time off to go to school can be paid for the work that they're doing as they're learning and contributing to the hydrogen workforce or other energy sectors. And apprenticeship is also important in that it creates transferable skills. It's a credential that someone could take from the hydrogen workforce to the offshore wind workforce, or becoming an electrician just creates opportunities for people that are part of both ensuring pathways to middle-class jobs and are a structured way to ensure that mentorship, on-the-job training that brings people into the energy sector.
Great points. Thank you both. And I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Manuel asks, one of the problems we're facing in Arkansas is that the resources to create a workforce are scattered and that the challenge is to put them together, but considering the timing, we don't want to end up with a bottleneck of trained workers, but low demand. Any tips or advice for how to kind of coordinate those resources, but also a timing piece of how to ensure that trained workers don't end up without an actual job to be placed in?
I feel a little bit like a broken record here, but I do feel like this is another area in which project labor agreements can be really useful and important because they're part of their understanding, for instance, when we think about the apprenticeship pipeline, unions only want to take in as many workers as they know that they will have jobs for in the future. And so that there isn't that oversupply of skilled workers, trained workers without jobs to put them into. It's also that training in a broad occupational skill set so that someone can work on the bridge projects or the water systems or in offshore wind or any of the other kind of competing categories of construction that Susie was talking about. You're creating the skilled workforce to supply all of these needs across the economy, whether that's hydrogen, other parts of the energy sector, other infrastructure projects. And then a project labor agreement is key because it creates that certainty of saying, we know in 3 years, in 4 years, in 10 years, we can anticipate that this project is coming and begin to recruit and train those people today to stabilize and ensure we have the right supply of workers. And our office is doing a lot of research to try and get a little bit more information on the timeline of all of this, back to a question that Aziz posed, and thinking about what that means in different parts of the country. So this is also something hopefully we'll have a better sense of in the next few months, over the next year, as we see some of these investments being realized on the ground.
Yeah, Nikki, you're right about all of that. The project labor agreement really does protect everybody and ensures a viable future for jobs. I think really also important is what you just said, and we're going to put pressure on the Department of Energy to give us more detail on the pipeline, and the timeline for the IRA jobs. We know they're coming. and we know they have to come if we're gonna beat back the climate crisis. So, you know, patience isn't one of my virtues, and certainly it's not a virtue of anybody who needs a job. But we have other fields of work that we can put people into, and at least in Connecticut, the trades recognize that and are preparing for the workforce of the future. We just have to we have to practice some kind of patience and push on the departments of federal and state departments that are involved in the new renewable sectors to keep these jobs moving, to keep these projects moving ahead. Not an easy task, but it's something that everybody on this panel is geared up to do. So we just have to be out there.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your presentations and for answering these great questions, and to all of the participants today for tuning in and asking great questions and engaging with us. I know it's been a longer than normal webinar, but really appreciate all of the panelists for sharing their expertise. And as I mentioned, we will share the slides and the recording through our website and in a follow-up email. So thank you all, and please feel free to reach out to Kelsey or myself if you have any questions or want to get connected with any of the panelists.